Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. In this episode of the podcast, I wanted to focus upon third camp Trotskyism, sometimes called third camp socialism, sometimes called third camp heterodox Trotskyism, or sometimes called simply third campism. Um, I think that third campism is the clearest term because some third campists identify with Trotskyism, some identify with heterodox or atypical Trotskyism, and some have rejected Trotskyism and heterodox Trotskyism altogether. So third campism by itself may be the best term to use or the clearest term to use for it. The problem with it is that it is a first worldist perspective. Like most approaches to communism and socialism, it emphasizes the need to establish socialism or communism and the need to destroy capitalism. But there is no focus upon the third world. If there is no focus on the third world, what does that mean? Well, it means that people will begin trying to establish communism or socialism where they live. And the good thing about Maoism third worldism is that it recognizes that the first world has failed to establish a, let's say, sustainable is probably a good word for it, communism or socialism in the first world for a reason, namely that there is a lack of revolutionary or dialectical potential in the first world. Secondly, there are a lack of class conscious proletarians in the first world. So, for that reason, Maoism third worldism says, well, we cannot dismiss the possibility that at some point in the future, there might be the possibility of establishing communism or socialism in the first world. But for now, that seems highly unlikely because the oppressed nations of the world, meaning the third world, are much more likely at this point to initiate communism and socialism because the first world is imperialist. That means that people living in the US and other first world countries are fat and happy and relatively wealthy compared to people in the third world. And I am just 2 miles north of the third world. So I have been there and I can tell you that is true. You simply cross over a river and you see what it's like on the other side of the world. And it is not very pretty. It is a sad thing to see. People who are literally starving, people who are in really, really bad economic shape, people who are forced into situations where they literally have to steal and sometimes behead other people in order to maintain their living. That's called the cartels, the drug cartels, which are a way of life in Mexico and throughout also much of Central America. So, in any event, the idea of establishing communism or socialism in the first world seems rather unlikely. Does that mean it's impossible? No, it's not impossible. No one knows what will happen for sure in the future, but unlikely because where is it? In other words, we've tried. We've tried in the first world to establish communism or socialism, and it has failed. By the same token, to be honest, we've tried in the third world, in Cuba, and communism or socialism in Cuba is dying there as well. So, really, communism or socialism has not been successful anywhere in terms of a large scale development of a new type of economic system. The question is why? What I would say it is because the world is dominated by the capitalist world system. So it's not just looking at individual countries like Cuba, like Vietnam, for example, and saying, well, okay, why were they, as third world countries, that developed communism or socialism, why were they able to establish it, but now they seem to have withdrawn from it? And the communism or socialism that at one time may have existed there, such as in Cuba during the lifetime of Fidel Castro, is now falling apart. And I would say that the answer to that question is that Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, etc., do not live in a vacuum, do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in the capitalist world system. And the capitalist world system has oppressed them, has cut them off from many lines of monetary assistance, from trade, etc. And so it's very difficult, if not impossible, being a communist or socialist country under the capitalist world system. So what needs to change is not just a single society, but there need to be revolutions in a post-capitalist society, revolutions which will establish communism or capitalism, hopefully in many places where there is no communism or capitalism, which is the basic foundation or substructure of society. So I would say that that may be the reason why, even though we have seen incidents or cases of communism or socialism in the third world, they have not lasted. It is difficult to do that in a world dominated, for example, now by the US, which is the king of imperialist countries around the world. So I would say that until the first world goes away, or at least becomes less dominant, less powerful, establishing communism or socialism will continue to be very, very difficult. Many people have looked to try to establish communism or socialism, for example, right here in the US. I know that because I was one of them. I tried back in the late 1960s, in 1968 and 1969, when I was active in the New Left, a member of the Students' Democratic Coalition, and we failed, meaning not just me, but the New Left itself failed. We are still living in a capitalist world system. We tried, for example, in the Students' Democratic Coalition, to help migrant workers, Mexican migrant workers in California. We really tried. We tried to get people to sign petitions pledging not to buy California grapes. I could not even get my own parents to sign a petition. And my father was a member of the only communist union in the United States, the Distributive Workers Union. Why he would not sign it remains a mystery to me, but he would not. I never asked him. Why? Because at that time, I was unaware that his union was a communist union, a pro-communist union. In fact, back in the 1950s, his union was the only branch of the AFL-CIO which refused to sign a pledge against communism. As a result, they were kicked out of the AFL-CIO and became an independent union known as the Distributive Workers Union, or District 65. My father loved his union, and I'm sure he must have known that it was a pro-communist union, and yet even he would not sign that petition, which is something till this day I cannot figure out. But regardless, even if he would have signed that petition, it would not have made any difference, because when I look at the situation of the migrant workers in California from Mexico, their situation now is worse than it was in the late 1960s. Not better, it is worse. So basically the work that we did was, well, I mean, it was a good effort, but it really came to nothing. We tried really hard, but we were ultimately unsuccessful. And now, here in 2024, we are basically at a point where we literally have no organized left in the United States. I mean, there are certain organizations, certainly, which could be considered leftist, and certain movements which could be considered leftist, such as my own. But are they really successful right now? No. Might they be successful in the future? Well, in the case of my own movement, yes, I hope that there will eventually be communist or socialist revolutions in the third world. In the first world, maybe eventually, but not initially. I think that the first places that will experience these revolutions will be places in the third world. Why? Well, simple. Um, the first world is prosperous. The first world is imperialist. As any Marxist knows, imperialism is the major contradiction of capitalism. And so if you are living in an imperialist country, if you are well fed, you look around the world and you see how bad off some people living in the third world are. Me, for example, living 2 miles north of Mexico. We continually are warned, do not cross over into most of Mexico. Now, there are some places like Nuevo Progreso that are relatively safe, but you go over to Reynosa, which is right near me, and you risk being decapitated. That is a major risk. It doesn't happen on a regular basis, but it happens enough to frighten people not to go there. It's because of the power of the cartels, the drug gangs that run not only Mexico, but also Central America. It is a very sad situation for the people who live in that part of the world. Now, people who live here are also victimized by the cartels, but in a much different way. We have tremendous corruption, especially medical corruption, here on the US side of the Rio Grande Valley. We have the tunnels that come from Mexico and go into the United States. As a result, there are cartel members who live here on the US side of the Rio Grande Valley, including right here in Mission, Texas, but they don't cause any harm to Americans. Their job is to pick up the drugs and then to transport them throughout North America. So we are affected by it, but we are not affected by it in the same way as people who live in Mexico and Central America are. Okay, so that is the main argument that I think can be made against first worldism. That first worldism, which assumes that it is possible to establish communism or socialism in the first world now, is really not possible. I don't think that it'll happen for a long time, if ever. If there is a first world, say 100, 200, 300, I'm just guessing, years from now, maybe at that point, there will be a possibility of doing it. But in my view, the third world needs to take the lead. And that's not because I, as a first worlder, am trying to push the burden onto people in the third world. It's because I understand how things work as a sociologist. Imperialist countries like the US, generally people in those countries do not complain. And so you very rarely see revolutions or coups d'etats in those countries. On the other hand, in countries of the third world, where people are not imperialist, where people are the victims of imperialism, where people are generally poor, in some cases starving to death, there you are more likely to see revolutions and coups d'etats. So I regret that much of my life as a commie and a socialist has been as a first worldist, because I realize now that although I was well intentioned, certainly I did not want anything bad to happen to anybody, that my efforts really were not very well grounded, meaning I didn't really do anything. I didn't really accomplish anything. Like what did I do in my 2 years as a part of the New Left? I look back on it, and I certainly was very positive and optimistic. All of us were who were involved in our little group, but we didn't accomplish anything. We tried, and we did our best to do what we thought was in the best interests of the United States and the world, but we really were unsuccessful in that. So I think that it needs to begin in the third world, not necessarily end there, although it might, but it needs to begin in the third world, the place of wants, not in the place of haves. The haves and the have-nots. The haves are not likely going to stage a revolution. The have-nots are the ones who are most likely to stage revolutions. Let me give you an example of an organization that I belong to, briefly, actually, for only about 7 months, up until about June of last year, called Solidarity. Now, Solidarity is a communist organization, a Trotskyist or heterodox Trotskyist, meaning atypical Trotskyist organization. It is third campist, which is why it's heterodox, because Lev Trotsky did not agree with it. In fact, Lev Trotsky viciously attacked third camp Trotskyism, which is why some people associated with the movement stopped using the term Trotskyism and just began calling it third campism. It was a very controversial movement at that time because it caused a major split in the Trotskyist movement just in the years prior to World War I. And that was a time when just shortly after Trotsky had taken a major trip to the United States and Trotskyism was beginning to become organized in the US, then all of a sudden you had groups like ours, basically the third camp movement, which basically disrupted the development of Trotskyism. Do I think now that that was a bad thing? No, because I don't think that Trotskyism really would have worked anyway. I think it was a defective ideology or tendency. But certainly the presence of third campism did nothing to advance the cause of Trotskyism. What third campism basically argued is, and without getting into too many specifics, trying to avoid combing around in the weeds, is that you have the imperialist powers, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, and then you have the proletariat and the subaltern. Okay, so that's the arrangement. So, for example, the United States might be seen as the first camp, the Soviet Union, now Russia, might be seen as the second camp. The third camp, the proletariat and the subaltern. Now, okay, when I look at what we did in Solidarity, and even before I belonged to Solidarity, for the 10 years, I thought of myself as a third campist. I do not recall a single effort that I or anyone I know did to establish communism or socialism specifically in the third world. Instead, almost all of our efforts were devoted to the first world. Now, that's just one example. There are many examples. Third camp Trotskyism is simply a case study. If you look at communism in the US in general, or socialism in the US in general, it has basically been focused on the first world. And the first world as an imperialist force in the world is not a likely place or a likely situation that you would expect to see communism or socialism to emerge out of. And that is precisely what we have seen. We have not seen communism or socialism in the world today. And I would argue that is because the attention of communists or socialists has been misdirected. Instead of being focused on the third world, where there is at least some dialectical or revolutionary potential, the attention has been focused upon the first world, where there is very little dialectical or revolutionary potential. Also, I'm not going to say that there are no proletarians in the first world. That would be silly. Obviously, there are some. I know some. Some very devoted, dedicated proletarians in the United States. The problem is there are simply not enough of us. There are not enough of us. You need a large quantity of class conscious workers to bring about revolutionary change. And we don't have that in the first world. In the third world, which is an oppressed part of the world, there is at least the potential to have those class conscious workers. Why? Again, because they represent the have-nots, and the have-nots are more likely to challenge the status quo than the haves, because they lack things that they see around them. In other words, they look at the news, they read newspapers, and they see all the things that we have here in the West, here in the North, global North, or the first world. And they say, we don't have those things. We want them. How do we get them? And they realize eventually that, well, we can try to get loans from the first world, but they've tried that for a long time. That has not worked out very well. And so in many cases, like say in Iran in 1979, they staged a revolution against the government, against Shah Pahlavi. What many people do not realize is that that revolution was really a revolution against the US, because it was the US that put Shah Pahlavi in power in Iran, because the US staged a coup d'etat in 1953 to topple President Mossadegh from his position as president of Iran. Why? Because President Mossadegh pledged to nationalize oil, which is something that the United States did not want. And so it overturned President Mossadegh, put in Shah Pahlavi, and in 1979, Shah Pahlavi was toppled in a revolution, and we got Ayatollah Khomeini, who was certainly no bargain either. But when you have revolutions, there is no guarantee on the result. That is why when people stage revolutions, they need to be class conscious. I am not convinced that the people who staged the Iranian Revolution in 1979 fit that bill. They certainly were oppressed, but they really did not have any clear agenda, meaning they didn't know exactly what they were fighting for. And consequently, what they got was really not what they wanted. Now, is Iran that bad off right now? No. Iran is not Saudi Arabia. Iran is a relatively free country. Women are not like the Saudi women. They can work. They can become lawyers and medical doctors and attorneys and professors and so on. So it's not like Saudi Arabia, but still it's not a communist country either. It's somewhat, I guess you could say, fascistic. It is a theocracy, and a theocracy is not consistent with communism or socialism. And so the point of this podcast was simply to point out that first, worldism has failed. And whatever we have tried to do in the past, including here in the US, in my case with the New Left, or later with third camp Trotskyism, failed. Now, was I poorly intentioned? No. I mean, I wanted the best to come out of my efforts. Obviously, I was not trying to waste my time. I had better things to do. So I certainly was trying to bring about a better world, but I didn't know how to do it. And for some reason, even though I was initially a Maoist third worldist after going through a string of other communist tendencies, I left Maoism third worldism, became a third campist for about a decade, and then returned to Maoism third worldism only this past June. So not even a year yet. But I hope that my telling the story can be informative for other people. The basic idea is, please do not rely upon the first world. The first world is not going to bring about communism or socialism at this time in history. Maybe 100 years from now, maybe sooner, maybe later, but not right now. We need to put our energy on the third world to engage in conscientization, critical conscience, or consciousness raising to make the masses of the third world aware of their power and their ability to establish communism or socialism. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.